welcome back. Today I'm going to teach you how to hand stitch an 18th century housewife, which is really just an outdated term for a sewing roll or a sewing kit, or even just something that one could keep personal objects in like money or jewelry. These items were highly variable. They could be intricate with hidden compartments and mirrors, or really simple, just a strip of fabric with rectangular pockets stitched on. These objects belong to people from all walks of life, and one of the slides you saw earlier was a quote from a lady who was speaking at the trial of her offenders. She was a midwife and had been lured to a false labor in order to be robbed, and one of the things that the thieves took was her housewife. This lady's housewife might have been made from scrapped shift or a scrap petticoat, just whatever fabric she had on hand. But in the next slide, you see that these objects were also given to the pages or servants of the Prince Regent. Really nicely made, I'm assuming, considering they were made of silk and contained silk and thread, basically for these servants to attend to the prince's wardrobe at any given moment. Regardless of the purpose or the style of the hussif or housewife, nearly all of them were made from leftover fabric or scraps or cabbage, and that's definitely something we can appreciate today. I definitely try to put out as little waste into this planet as I possibly can, so a housewife was the perfect way for me to use up some of my old fabrics. And a couple of years ago, I made a pattern for my own based on extant examples, which I will link below. That's what we're going to be using today, so let's get into it. Because I get asked this all the time, for this project I'm going to be using a very thin French millinery needle that you can get at Burnley and Trowbridge. The first step in this project is to hem one side of each pocket piece. I'm going to be using a tiny hem of about 1/8 of an inch, but 1/4 inch works just as well here. While hemming, try to stick to about 8 to 10 stitches per inch. One pocket done, on to the next. You may have noticed that I hemmed the first piece by tensioning the fabric over my finger and stitching toward my body. This gets the job done, and it's how I stitch when I'm in a hurry. But the more historically correct way is to pin the fabric and stitch away from the body. I'm demonstrating that for you here, just so you can see the difference. In the end, it doesn't really matter as long as you get the pieces hemmed. Once the 4 pocket pieces are hemmed, we need to turn under the straight edge of the curved end piece by about 1/4 of an inch and baste it into place. I'm using the remains of an old spool of thread for this purpose, but you can use whatever you have on hand. We also need to baste the remaining long side of each pocket piece, except one. Next up, we're going to match the curved end piece to its position on the lining fabric. I'm using a heat-sensitive pen to mark where I want the edge to line up, but you can also just baste it into place or use pins. I prefer to mark it so I don't accidentally shift off grain. To secure the piece, I'm going to use about 10 whip stitches to the inch. With the end piece secured, I'm going to move on to the first pocket. This should be layered ever so slightly over the piece before it. Once again, I'm marking the line with a heat-sensitive pen, but this time I'm also pinning down the edges to keep everything nice and straight. We're not going to be sewing down the sides of the pocket until later. The last piece here will be the one remaining pocket with only one edge hemmed. this should be pinned in place. Depending on how wide your hems are, you may end up with a bit of extra lining fabric at the end here, so just trim it off if you do. Once you have a clean edge to work with, baste this last pocket in place. At this point, we need to take our pocket-covered lining and place it on top of our exterior fabric. We also need to trim off the excess as we did with the lining. If you're going to add a bit of wool to hold your pins and needles, this is the time to pin it on. After that, we need to pin and/or baste around the outside of the housewife. Be careful at the top corners of each pocket. You want to ensure they continue to overlap a bit. Just to keep things extra sturdy, I like to take a couple of whip stitches along the bottom of the wool piece. Time for binding. Most of the time when I send out a kit, I include linen or cotton tape, but since I have a ridiculous amount of fabric strips on hand, I'm going to use that instead. Tape is a bit easier and doesn't require as much fiddling, but I love the effect that a slightly mismatched fabric gives. I'm going to have to join the strips together to make one continuous bit of binding, but luckily that's seen in quite a few extant pieces. I'm going to bind the bottom edge first. You could just do one continuous piece of binding all the way around the edge, but I find this a lot easier to maneuver with corners. That, and I don't want to stitch any more binding together. To begin, I'm placing the right side of the binding to the pocket side and backstitching about 3/16 of an inch away from the edge. Once I trim off the excess, I'm going to turn the binding over to the exterior of our housewife. The raw edge needs to be turned under to create a tiny 1/4 inch border. When I like the look of it, I'll carefully slip stitch the binding down with about 8 stitches to the inch. There's no stress on this seam, so there's no need to be ridiculous with tiny stitches. With the bottom edge secure, it's time to pin the rest of the binding. This is pretty straightforward, literally, until you get to the curved edge. Because I'm not using bias cut binding, something our 18th century counterparts wouldn't have done either, getting things to not curl up on this edge require a bit of fussing. I like to put a few extremely tiny tucks here to make things go more smoothly. By the time this part of the binding is turned over, you won't even see them. Just as before, the right side of the binding has been pinned to the pocket face of the housewife. Also as before, I'm going to secure it with a back stitch about 3/16 of an inch away from the edge. Even with the tiny tucks that I pinned into the binding around this curved edge, it still requires some coddling. Just take care here, and if it's not perfect, oh well. With what is, in my opinion, the most tedious part of this project complete, we can now remove all of the basting stitches that may have been forgotten and move on to the last 2 steps. As before, I'm going to flip the piece pocket side down and begin turning under the raw edges. I like to start at the curved end because it's usually the worst, so I find it's best to get it over with quickly. Okay, no, I actually just start here to prevent anything from getting wibbly as I go along. Also, if you've never used these clips before, I highly recommend them, even if you're only going to own them in order to bind things. Starting at the center point of the curved edge, I'm going to slip stitch the binding until I reach the end, then secure the thread and return to the center point in order to go back down the other side. One side down, time to finish the binding. Did I mention this is the most tedious part for me? Final step. In order to keep this thing rolled up, we need to attach a bit of tape or ribbon to the center point of the curved edge on the exterior of the piece. You could use just about anything here, but I'm using a bit of black silk ribbon because I'm nothing if not dramatic. The ribbon just needs to be secured with quite a few whip stitches, and that's that. It's done! If you make one of these using this tutorial, please let me know in the comments or send me a message on Instagram because I'd really like to see it. This might become one of your favorite historical accessories. It's definitely one of mine. I keep it in my pocket at events full of all the weird random things I might need, so I'll put extra pins, sewing supplies, band-aids, money, and I don't want to have to spend a couple of minutes digging around in my massive pockets for it. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't, and stick around because I'm going to be making more tutorials about different subjects. Thank you so much for watching. See you soon.